Welcome back, guys. Tonight, let yourself drift back through time to a world caught between the familiar rhythms of everyday life and the unprecedented upheaval of the Great War. As you settle into comfort, imagine stepping away from the grand narratives of battles won and lost, and instead walking quietly into the lived experiences of those who endured between 1914 and 1918. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below. You'll find yourself first in the intimate spaces of survival dugouts carved from earth, where men waited through endless hours, with the smell of damp wood mixed with tobacco smoke, and where letters from home were read by flickering candlelight. The war was not just the thunder of artillery or the horror of gas attacks, though these elements shaped every moment. It was also the mundane persistence of human routines, the careful rationing of chocolate, the mending of torn clothing, the quiet conversations that stretched through cold nights. Tonight, we'll witness one of history's most remarkable pause, when enemies became human to each other across a strip of devastated land on Christmas Day, 1914. You'll walk through archaeological discoveries that revealed the most personal artifacts of soldiers who never returned home. Their stories emerging from the soil decades later. And finally, you'll step into the contrasting world of those who directed the war from comfortable rooms where fine china held afternoon tea, while maps marked with pens represented the lives of thousands. These were not just soldiers and officers, but bakers' sons and university students, fathers writing final letters, and young men discovering courage they never knew they possessed. As we explore their world together, allow their stories to wash over you like gentle waves, carrying you toward the peaceful rest that they, in their time of conflict, could only dream of finding. The dugout stretches before you, carved 15 feet below the surface of what was once a Belgian farmer's field. Imagine yourself descending the rough wooden steps, your hand trailing along walls reinforced with salvaged timber and corrugated iron sheets. The air grows thicker as you move deeper, heavy with the mingled scents of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the acrid temps of creosote used to preserve the wooden supports. Water seeps constantly through the earthen walls, creating a perpetual dampness that penetrates clothing, bones, spirits alike. This underground world housed 12 men of the Lancashire Fusiliers through the winter of 1916. Their names were written in pencil on a wooden beam. Tommy Ashworth, age 19, a mill worker from Manchester. Private Davies, who had been a schoolteacher before the war. Corporal Henderson, whose wife sent him hand-knitted socks that never quite dried in the perpetual moisture. Each man claimed a sleeping space barely wider than his shoulders, marked by personal belongings arranged with a careful precision of those who owned almost nothing. The rhythm of their days began before dawn, when the first man to wake would light the small brass oil lamp that hung from the central beam. The flame cast dancing shadows across faces that had aged years and months, across walls decorated with photographs of sweethearts and family members whose images grew more precious with each passing day. The morning ritual was always the same: check weapons, inspect equipment, and prepare for the stand-to that occurred at first light, when both sides anticipated the most likely time for attack. Breakfast, when available, consisted of hardtack biscuits, so tough they required soaking in weak tea to become edible, accompanied by tinned beef that bore little resemblance to any meat they had known in civilian life. The men ate slowly, savoring each bite, not for its flavor, but for the simple act of nourishment, the brief moment of normalcy in their underground existence. Conversation during meals was subdued, often limited to practical matters: whose turn it was to clean the rifles, whether the rats had gotten into the food supplies again, speculation about when the next supply convoy might arrive. The rats were constant companions, bold creatures that had grown fat on the detritus of war. They scurried across sleeping men without fear, their red eyes gleaming in the lamplight as they searched for crumbs or anything remotely edible. Some soldiers named the largest rats, creating a twisted sense of companionship with creatures that, like themselves, had adapted to this subterranean existence. The rats served as an early warning system to their sudden flight. Often preceded the whistle of incoming artillery shells. Between the organized chaos of battle, the dugout settled into patterns of waiting that stretched hours into what felt like days. Men played cards with decks so worn the suits were barely visible, betting with buttons or cigarettes when money had long since lost its meaning. Private Matthews, a carpenter in peacetime, carved intricate figures from spent bullet casings, his hands maintaining their skill even as his mind grappled with the impossibility of his situation. Others wrote letters home, crafting careful lies about their comfort and safety, scribing fictional meals in imaginary dry beds. The writing process was itself a ritual of survival. Men hunched over precious sheets of paper, protecting them from the constant dripping that threatened to blur the ink before the words could reach their destinations. They wrote by lamplight, or, during the day, by the pale illumination that filtered down through the dugout entrance. Every letter was a small act of hope, a bridge thrown across the chasm between their current reality and the world they had left behind, a world that seemed increasingly impossible to imagine. Returning to dot reading occupied countless hours. Though books were scarce and precious, a single copy of Dickens might pass through dozens of hands, its pages growing soft with handling, margins filled with penciled comments and observations. Men read aloud to each other in the evening, their voices creating a cocoon of familiar words against the backdrop of distant gunfire. The act of listening to stories transported them, however, briefly, beyond the confines of their earthen prison. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the constant sounds of war, the rhythmic thump of artillery in the distance, the scratch and rustle of rats in the walls. The breathing and movements of 11 other men crowded into a space designed for solitude. Dreams, when they came, were often more vivid than waking life, filled with memories of home, of peaceful Sunday mornings and the sound of church bells, of mothers calling the men for supper. Waking from such dreams required a moment of cruel reorientation, a return to the weight of mud-stained uniforms and the knowledge that another day of survival lay ahead. The dugout's atmosphere grew thicker as days passed without adequate ventilation. The brass lamp consumed what little fresh air filtered down from above, while the exhalation of 12 men and the gases seeping from their equipment created a toxic mixture that left everyone feeling slightly lightheaded and perpetually tired. Men learned to move slowly, to conserve both energy and oxygen, developing an economy of motion that made every gesture deliberate and purposeful. Personal hygiene became a careful negotiation with their environment. Water was too precious for washing, reserved instead for drinking and the occasional cleaning of weapons. Men learned to live with layers of grime that settled into the lines of their faces and the creases of their hands. Shaving became a weekly luxury when hot water could be spared, a ritual that temporarily restored a sense of humanity and normalcy. The small mirror, cracked and spotted, reflected faces they sometimes barely recognized as their own. The psychological weight of confinement pressed upon them as heavily as the earth above their heads. Some men developed a compulsive need to check and recheck their equipment, finding in the familiar routine of weapon maintenance an anchor against the uncertainty that defined every aspect of their existence. Others retreated into silence, spending hours staring at the dancing shadows on the wall, their minds, perhaps, walking along remembered streets or sitting in familiar chairs by hearth fires they might never see again. Communication with the world above came through a complex network of runners and telephone lines that were constantly being severed by shell fire and just as constantly being repaired. Orders arrived written on scraps of paper, often smudged and difficult to read, carrying information that might be hours or days old by the time it reached the dugout. The men learned to interpret not just the words of these messages, but their tone, their urgency, the implications hidden between the lines that might spell the difference between another day of waiting and orders to advance into the maelstrom above. When gas attacks came, the dugout became both sanctuary and trap. The heavier-than-air poison gases settled into low places, making their underground refuge potentially deadly. Men learned to recognize the subtle changes in air quality that preceded such attacks. The slight sweetness that might indicate chlorine, the bitter almond scent that could mean hydrogen cyanide. Gas masks, crude and uncomfortable, hung ready at every man's side, their rubber and canvas construction offering uncertain protection against an invisible enemy that could kill in minutes. The mud of the Western Front possessed qualities that defied description to those who had never experienced its particular horror. Imagine yourself standing at the dugout entrance during the autumn rains of 1916, watching as the world above transforms into a landscape that seems more liquid than solid. This was not the clean earth of a garden or the honest dirt of a farmyard, but a gray-brown substance that clung with desperate tenacity to everything it touched, as if the ground itself had become hungry for human contact. The composition of this mud told the story of the war in layers. At its surface lay the fresh accumulation of recent rains, mixed with the churned debris of battle, splintered wood from destroyed wagons, fragments of metal from exploded shells, threads of fabric from uniforms that had once clothed men who now rested beneath the soil. Deeper down, the mud held older secret bones of horses that had died months earlier, the leather remnants of abandoned equipment, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, personal effects that had been lost or dropped during the chaos of retreat. And advance. Private Williamson, a farmer's son from Yorkshire who understood soil in ways his urban comrades could not, observed that this mud seemed almost alive in its malevolence. It possessed a weight that seemed disproportionate to its volume, as if grief itself had been mixed into its composition. When men walked through it, their boots disappeared completely with each step, requiring enormous effort to extract, creating a sucking sound that became one of the signature melodies of the Western Front. The energy required to move through such terrain exhausted soldiers before they ever encountered the enemy. The psychological effect of the mud extended far beyond its physical properties. Men who had once taken pride in their appearance, who had spent careful minutes each morning ensuring their uniforms were properly pressed and their boots adequately shined, found themselves reduced to creatures caked in filth from head to toe. The mud worked its way into every crease of clothing, every fold of skin, creating a uniform gray coating that made all men appear identical, as if the war were systematically erasing their individual identities. Cleaning became not just difficult, but nearly impossible. Water, when available, was too precious to waste on the futile task of removing mud that would return within minutes of venturing above ground. Men learned to scrape the worst accumulations from their clothing with knives or sticks, but complete cleanliness became a memory, something that belonged to the world they had left behind. Some soldiers reported forgetting what their own skin looked like beneath the layers of grime, losing connection with their physical selves in ways that would haunt them long after the war ended. The mud created its own ecosystem of discomfort. It harbored parasites and bacteria that caused infections and illnesses unknown to medical textbooks. Trenchfoot, a condition where prolonged exposure to wet conditions caused flesh to rot while still attached to living bone, became endemic among troops who could not remove their boots for days at a time. The smell of infected feet mingled with the other odors of the front cordite, decay, unwashed bodies, and the sweet sick scent of poison gas that lingered in low places. Long after attacks had ended, personal possessions became casualties of the mud's relentless advance. Letters from home, carefully preserved in breast pockets, dissolved into unreadable pulp when water seeped through supposedly waterproof oilcloth. Photographs of loved ones, the visual anchors that connected soldiers to their former lives, became stained and blurred beyond recognition. Men learned to memorize the faces in their pictures, knowing that the physical images would inevitably succumb to the environment's destructive power. As the mud seemed to wage its own war against memory, systematically destroying the tangible connections between soldiers and the world they fought to preserve. The process of eating in such conditions required ingenuity and compromise. Food became contaminated almost immediately upon opening, requiring men to consume their rations quickly or accept that everything would taste of earth and rain. Water purification tablets, when available, could remove some bacteria, but could not eliminate the metallic taste that came from water filtered through soil saturated with the debris of war. Men learned to eat in darkness when possible, as seeing the true color and consistency of their food under lamplight often made consumption impossible. Sleep in the mud became a skill requiring careful planning and constant vigilance. Men learned to construct small islands of relatively dry ground using whatever materials they could salvage: boards torn from destroyed buildings, sandbags that had begun to deteriorate, even the bodies of dead horses when desperation demanded. Such grisly pragmatism. These sleeping platforms were jealously guarded. They represented the difference between rest and a night spent shivering in pools of contaminated water. The sound of rain on canvas or corrugated iron became simultaneously comforting and threatening, promising relief from the heat of summer, but ensuring the continuation of their sodden misery. The mud affected military operations in ways that no strategic planning had anticipated. Artillery shells, instead of exploding on contact with solid ground, often buried themselves deep in the soft earth before detonating, creating craters that immediately filled with water and became impassable obstacles. Machine gun positions, carefully constructed during dry weather, became unusable when their firing mechanisms clogged with the omnipresent filth. Supply lines that had been marked on maps as viable routes became impassable quagmires that swallowed entire wagon trains, leaving troops without food, ammunition, or medical supplies for days at a time. Communication across the muddy landscape presented challenges that tested human ingenuity. Telephone lines, strung carefully across the battlefield, snapped under the weight of accumulated mud or were severed by the constant shifting of the saturated ground. Runners carrying messages between positions often became lost in landscapes where familiar landmarks disappeared beneath uniform gray coating, where shell craters filled with water looked identical from every angle. Some messages never arrived, their carriers claimed by the treacherous footing that could swallow a man completely in minutes. The mud preserved evidence of human cues, passage, in ways that became both fascinating and horrifying to observe. Footprints remained visible for weeks, creating a palimpsest of movement that told stories of advance and retreat, of supply runs and desperate flights from danger. Bootprints of different armies could be distinguished by those who learned to read such signs: the hobnailed soles of German infantry, the smoother impressions left by British boots, the distinctive patterns of American-made footwear that began appearing in 1917. These impressions became a form of archaeological record, documenting the movement of armies across landscapes that seemed designed to trap and hold. Evidence of human struggle. Personal hygiene rituals adapted to the constraints of perpetual filth in ways that would have seemed impossible in civilian life. Men learned to clean their teeth with twigs or their fingers, having long ago lost or destroyed their toothbrushes. Shaving became a weekly ceremony when hot water could be spared and when mirrors could be kept clean long enough to see one's reflection. The ritual of shaving took on almost sacred significance. Brief return to civilized behavior, that connected soldiers to their peacetime identities. The act of scraping away whiskers also removed layers of accumulated grime, revealing patches of skin that seemed shockingly pale and vulnerable after days of concealment beneath mud and dirt. The psychological impact of living in such conditions created forms of adaptation that bordered on the pathological. Some men developed obsessive relationships with cleanliness, spending hours attempting to clean equipment that would be filthy again within minutes of use. Others embraced the filth as a form of camouflage or protection, believing that the mud made them invisible to enemy snipers or provided some supernatural shield against bullets and shrapnel. These adaptations, while sometimes effective for short-term survival, often created lasting mental patterns that proved difficult to abandon. When the war finally ended, medical care in muddy conditions presented challenges that pushed military medicine into entirely new territories. Wounds became infected almost immediately when contaminated earth entered cuts and abrasions. Stretcher bearers struggled to transport wounded men across terrain where every step risked dropping their patients into water-filled craters. Field hospitals, supposedly protected from direct combat, found themselves dealing with diseases and infections that had nothing to do with enemy action and everything to do with the hostile environment in which the war was being fought. In the depths of their earthen refuge, the 12 men of the Lancashire Fusiliers existed within a complex symphony of sound that marked the rhythm of their days and haunted their nights. Imagine yourself settling into the corner of their dugout, your back against the rough timber wall, as you attune your ears to the acoustic landscape that defined existence on the Western Front. Each sound carried meaning, conveyed information crucial to survival, and created a soundtrack to experiences that would echo in survivors' memories for decades after the guns fell silent. The dominant percussion of their world came from artillery fire, a sound so constant that its absence, rather than its presence, became noteworthy. The distant thump of heavy guns firing from positions miles behind the lines created a bass note that soldiers felt in their chests rather than simply heard with their ears. These sounds arrived with their own vocabulary of survival. The quick succession of pops that indicated machine gun fire, the whistling crescendo that meant incoming shells, the sudden silence that often preceded gas attacks. Men learned to distinguish between outgoing and incoming fire, between their own artillery providing cover and enemy shells seeking their destruction. Private Henderson, who had worked in his father's clock repair shop before the war, developed an almost supernatural ability to identify the caliber and approximate distance of artillery pieces by their acoustic signatures alone. The deep boom of a German 420mm howitzer carried differently through the air than the sharper crack of a British 18-pounder field gun. The time delay between the flash visible on the horizon and the arrival of the sound allowed experienced soldiers to calculate approximate distances and determine whether they were in immediate danger or merely witnessing someone else's catastrophe. Within the dugout itself, a different acoustic environment prevailed. The constant dripping of water through the earthen walls created an irregular percussion that some men found maddening, while others discovered it soothing. A natural white noise that masked other, more disturbing sounds. The creaking of wooden support beams stressed by the weight of soil and sandbags above provided an ongoing reminder of their precarious situation. These groans and sighs of timber under pressure became familiar voices, and men learned to distinguish between the normal settling sounds and the more ominous cracks that might indicate structural failure. The rustling of rats in the walls created a soundtrack that accompanied nearly every activity. These creatures, grown bold and numerous on the abundance of food provided by human conflict, moved through spaces between the timber and corrugated iron with the confidence of long-time residents. Their scratching became so constant that many soldiers ceased to notice it consciously, though the sound registered in their subconscious minds and influenced their sleep patterns. Some men reported dreaming of being pursued by armies of giant rats, their scrabbling claws amplified into the sound of approaching enemy soldiers. Human sounds within the confined space took on special significance. The rhythm of breathing from 12 sleeping men created a complex pattern that those suffering from insomnia learned to use as a form of meditation. Snoring, normally merely annoying, became a comfort that indicated life and relative safety. The sudden cessation of a man's regular breathing pattern could wake everyone instantly. His fear of gas attacks made any change in normal sounds potentially significant. Coughing, unfortunately common due to the poor air quality and the lingering effects of gas exposure, go through the confined space and often triggered sympathetic coughing fits from other occupants. Conversation in the dugout developed its own patterns and conventions. Voices were kept deliberately low, both to avoid detection by enemy listening posts and to preserve the fragile privacy that each man required to maintain his sanity. Men learned to speak in shorthand, using fewer words to convey complex thoughts, developing a form of verbal efficiency that eliminated unnecessary syllables. Laughter, when it occurred, was precious and infectious, but it carried an edge of hysteria that spoke to the psychological pressure under which these men lived. The laughter of soldiers in wartime possessed a quality unknown in civilian life, simultaneously expressing joy and acknowledging the absurdity of their situation. Reading aloud became a cherished evening ritual that served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. The human voice reciting familiar stories created a barrier against the sounds of war, constructing an acoustic space where imagination could temporarily triumph over reality. Men took turns reading, and the quality of a man's reading voice often determined his popularity within the group. Corporal Davies, the former schoolteacher, possessed a particularly melodious voice that could make even the most mundane military regulations sound almost poetic. His readings from Dickens or Hardy transported his listeners to foggy London streets or pastoral English countryside, creating mental sanctuaries that provided psychological relief from their physical confinement. The preparation and consumption of food generated sounds that became associated with safety and normalcy. The scraping of knives against tin cans as men opened their rations, the bubbling of water heating over small spirit stoves, the careful crunching of hardtack biscuits. These everyday sounds created islands of domesticity within the larger ocean of military chaos. Men learned to savor not just the taste of their food, but the familiar sounds of its preparation, finding in these acoustic routines connections to the peaceful rituals of civilian meals. Letter writing produced its own distinctive sounds. The scratch of pencil on paper, the soft rustle of pages being turned, the gentle sigh that often preceded the composition of difficult passages. Men learned to recognize the sound of someone struggling with emotional content by the pauses in their writing, the longer intervals between pencil strokes as they searched for words adequate to express feelings for which no vocabulary seemed sufficient. The folding of completed letters created sharp, decisive sounds that marked the completion of another bridge built across the chasm between their current reality and the world they had left behind. Personal grooming activities, limited though they were by circumstances, generated sounds that maintained connections to civilian identity. The scraping of razor blades against whiskers during the weekly shaving ritual created sounds that momentarily transformed the dugout into something resembling a barbershop. The careful brushing of uniforms, attempted daily despite the futility of the effort, produced soft, whisking sounds that spoke to persistent human dignity in the face of degrading conditions. The cleaning of weapons, an obsessive daily ritual, generated metallic clicks and slides that became as familiar as heartbeats. The acoustic signature of gas attacks created perhaps the most terrifying sounds in the soldier's experience. The initial hiss of gas canisters being opened by enemy troops carried across no man's land with deadly clarity, right? The frantic ringing of gas alarm bells created cascades of metallic urgency that could wake men from the deepest sleep and send them scrambling for their masks. The sound of dozens of men breathing through gas mask filters created a collective mechanical wheeze that transformed human beings into something resembling industrial machinery. The muffled quality of all sounds heard through gas masks added an otherworldly quality to communication during attacks, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton, wool, and all human connection filtered through layers of rubber and canvas. Sleep, when it came, brought its own acoustic landscape. Men learned to distinguish between the breathing patterns of natural sleep and the labored breathing of those suffering from gas exposure or respiratory infections. Nightmares were common, and the sounds of men crying out in their sleep became so routine that they rarely woke their companions unless the distress seemed particularly severe. Some soldiers talked in their sleep, conducting conversations with family members thousands of miles away, or reliving traumatic experiences from previous battles. These nocturnal monologues provided insight into the psychological state of their speakers while simultaneously disturbing the rest of their listeners. The arrival of mail created perhaps the most joyful sounds in the dugout's acoustic repertoire. The rustling of paper as letters were opened, the intake of breath as men read news from home. The soft laughter triggered by amusing anecdotes from civilian life. These sounds created momentary festivals of human connection that brightened even the darkest days. Conversely, the sounds associated with bad news, the sharp intake of breath that preceded the reading of tragic information, the quiet sobbing of men who had lost family members, created their own tragic symphony that reminded everyone of the costs being paid far from the battlefield. Equipment, maintenance, generated constant background noise that spoke to the never-ending struggle to keep weapons and gear functional in hostile conditions. The clicking of rifle bolts being worked repeatedly to ensure smooth operation. The scraping of metal against metal as men cleaned and oiled their weapons. The tapping of hammers against tent pegs and other hardware. These sounds created a percussion section in the orchestra of survival. Men developed personal rhythms for these activities, creating individual signatures in their maintenance routines that their companions learned to recognize. The sounds of the dugout at night possessed a different quality than those of daylight hours. Without visual stimuli to distract them, men became more acutely aware of every acoustic detail of their environment. The settling of the earth above them seemed louder, the dripping of water more insistent, the movement of rats more pronounced. Some soldiers reported being able to hear the heartbeats of their sleeping companions. Though this was likely a psychological phenomenon, born of the intense intimacy forced upon them by their circumstances. The night sounds created their own form of music, a lullaby of survival that some men found soothing, while others found it maddening. Weather conditions dramatically altered the acoustic environment of their underground world. Drumming on. The corrugated iron roof created rhythms that could range from gentle pattering to violent thundering, depending on the intensity of the storm. Wind howling across the battlefield above generated eerie, moaning sounds that filtered down into their refuge, sometimes carrying with them the voices of wounded men calling for help from no man's land. Snow falling silently created perhaps the most unnerving acoustic condition of all, a muffled quality to all sounds that seemed to wrap the world in unnatural quiet, making every small noise seem amplified and threatening. The frost began forming on December 23, 1914, creating a crystalline coating over the devastated landscape between the German and British trenches near Ypres. Imagine yourself standing in the communication trench that connected the front line to the reserve positions, watching as nature performed its quiet transformation of the battlefield. The mud that had plagued soldiers for months solidified into something approaching solid ground, while the shell holes filled with ice that reflected the pale winter sky like broken mirrors scattered across no man's land. Private Frederick Mullins of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment had been writing letters home since dawn, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air as he attempted to describe his Christmas Eve to his mother in Birmingham. The pencil moved slowly across the paper, partially because his fingers were stiff with cold, and partially because he struggled to find words that would convey his situation without causing undue worry. How could he explain that he was spending the birthday of the Prince of Peace in a frozen trench, surrounded by the debris of human conflict, yet somehow finding himself filled with an inexplicable sense of anticipation? The German trenches, visible across the narrow strip of devastated ground, showed signs of unusual activity throughout the morning of December 24th. British sentries reported seeing figures moving about more freely than usual, apparently engaged in activities that seemed unrelated to military preparation. There were sounds drifting across the divide, voices raised in what might have been song, though the distance made the words indistinguishable. The melody, however, carried clearly through the crisp air, and some of the British soldiers began to recognize familiar hymns being sung in German. Captain James Crawford, career officer who had served in India before the war, found himself facing a situation for which his military training had provided no guidance. His men were reporting that the Germans appeared to be decorating their trenches with lights, small candles or lanterns that flickered along the parapet like earthbound stars. The sight was both beautiful and profoundly unsettling, as it humanized an enemy that military doctrine required him to view as a faceless threat. Through his field glasses, Crawford could see individual German soldiers moving about their positions with what appeared to be festive purpose. The transformation began subtly, with small gestures that accumulated throughout the day. A German soldier, visible for a moment above his trench, raised his hand in what might have been a wave. A British private, almost without thinking, returned the gesture. These tiny acknowledgments of shared humanity rippled along the lines, creating a momentum that no military regulation could contain. The war, which had consumed everything in its path for months, began to encounter something it could not digest: the persistent human capacity for recognition of common experience. As evening approached, the singing from the German trenches grew more organized and deliberate. The melody of O Tannenbaum drifted across no man's land with crystalline clarity, followed by Die, Wacht, Am, Rhein, and other songs that spoke of home and longing. The British soldiers, initially content to listen, began to respond with their own carols. The first Noel echoed from the British trenches, followed by God Rest the Merry Gentlemen, creating an impromptu concert that transformed the battlefield into something resembling a cathedral under the stars. Private Thomas Davies, a Welsh coal miner with a voice trained in chapel choirs, found himself singing louder than he had since childhood. The acoustic properties of the frozen landscape seemed to amplify every note, carrying the music farther than should have been possible. Other voices joined his, creating harmonies that bridged not only the physical distance between the trenches, but something far more significant: the psychological chasm that war had excavated between human beings who shared more similarities than differences. The German response came in the form of applause, clearly audible across the divide, followed by shouts of bravo and myrrh. The British soldiers, emboldened by this reception, launched into Silent Night. A song they had learned was originally German. The Germans responded by singing the same hymn in their own language, creating a duet that seemed to suspend the war itself. For those precious minutes, the trenches became stages for a performance that celebrated shared humanity rather than national division. Lance Corporal William Henderson, we'd been keeping a diary since the war began, struggled to capture the evening's events in words. How could he describe the surreal beauty of enemy soldiers lighting candles along their parapets, creating an impromptu constellation that rivaled the stars above? How could he convey the emotional impact of hearing Still No Hot sung in German by men who, hours earlier, had been trying to kill him? The inadequacy of language to capture the moment's significance frustrated him. Yet he continued writing, sensing that these events deserved to be preserved for posterity. The night passed, with minimal gunfire, as if both sides had agreed to an informal ceasefire without any official declaration. Men on both sides slept more soundly than they had in weeks, lulled by the unusual quiet and, perhaps, by the psychological relief of having acknowledged their enemy's humanity. The morning of Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, with frost creating delicate patterns on barbed wire that transformed the battlefield's most brutal elements into something approaching art. The first German to emerge from his trench did so hesitantly, his hands clearly visible and empty. He wore the gray uniform of a Bavarian regiment, and his youth was immediately apparent. He appeared barely old enough to shave, let alone carry a rifle. He stood uncertainly in no man's land, looking toward the British trenches with an expression that mixed fear and hope in equal measure. The moment stretched into eternity, pregnant with possibilities that could reshape the war or end his young life in an instant. The British response came from an unexpected source. Sergeant Major Harrison, a career soldier with 20 years of experience who had seen action in South Africa and had little patience for sentiment. Yet something about the young German's courage moved him to action. Harrison climbed slowly out of his trench, his movements deliberately non-threatening, and began walking across the frozen ground toward the German soldier. Other men from both sides watched in stunned silence as their representatives met in the middle of the battlefield that had claimed so many lives. The meeting between Harrison and the young German who introduced himself as Klaus, a student from Munich, lasted only a few minutes, but its impact rippled along both lines like electricity. They spoke in broken English and gestures, sharing cigarettes and comparing photographs of family members. Their conversation, witnessed by hundreds of soldiers on both sides, demonstrated that the enemy possessed faces, names, stories, and loved ones waiting at home. This revelation, simple yet profound, began to crack the psychological foundations upon which the war depended. The informal truce spread gradually along the front, sector by sector, as word of the initial meeting passed through the communication trenches. Not every unit participated. Some officers strictly forbade fraternization, while others found themselves powerless to prevent it. When the truce took hold, it transformed the battlefield into something unprecedented in military history. A space where enemies became, temporarily, simply human beings acknowledging their shared predicament under the cold Christmas sky. In some areas, the fraternization extended to the exchange of gifts. German soldiers offered cigars, beer, and homemade crafts in return for British cigarettes, chocolate, and souvenirs. These exchanges were conducted with the solemnity of diplomatic negotiations, as if both sides understood the profound significance of their actions. Photographs were shared. Stories were told through gestures and broken phrases in each other's languages. And for a few precious hours, the industrial machinery of death ground to a halt. The most remarkable aspect of the truce was how it revealed the artificial nature of the hatred that was supposed to fuel the conflict. Face to face with their enemies, soldiers discovered young men much like themselves, farmers, sons, and shop clerks, students and factory workers who had been swept up in events far beyond their control or understanding. The propaganda that had portrayed the enemy as inherently evil or subhuman collapsed in the face of direct human contact, revealing the complex web of political and economic forces that had created the war while leaving its participants largely innocent of its underlying causes. By afternoon, some areas had organized impromptu football matches on ground that had been a killing field the day before. The games were played with makeshift balls created from rags and string on pitches marked by shell craters and tangled wire. The scores were forgotten almost immediately, but the image of Germans and British soldiers playing together in no man's land became one of the war's most powerful symbols of human resilience and the persistent possibility of peace, even in the darkest circumstances. As Christmas Day progressed, the informal truce began to develop its own momentum and structure, transforming from spontaneous gesture into something approaching organized cooperation. Imagine yourself observing from a slight rise behind the British lines as soldiers from both armies worked together to recover the bodies of their fallen comrades. Men who had been lying in no man's land since the fierce fighting of early December. This grim but necessary task, performed with reverence and mutual assistance, created bonds between enemies that transcended the political rhetoric that had brought them to this place. Private Ernst Weber, a carpenter from the Black Forest region of Germany, found himself working alongside Corporal Michael O'Sullivan, an Irishman who had joined the British Army more for economic necessity than patriotic fervor. Together, they carried stretchers bearing the remains of soldiers whose nationalities had become irrelevant in death. Weber spoke enough English to communicate basic instructions, while O'Sullivan had picked up fragments of German during months of listening to enemy communications. Their conversation, conducted in a mixture of both languages, supplemented by gestures and shared understanding, is focused on practical matters: the weight of their burden, the treacherous footing created by frozen mud, the dignity owed to the dead, regardless of the uniform they wore. The recovery operation revealed the true cost of the war in ways that daily casualty reports could never convey. Bodies that had been lost in the confusion of night attacks were found pressed against the wire, their final moments written in the positions of their remains. Personal effects scattered by exploding shells were carefully collected and sorted, with German and British soldiers working together to reunite photographs, letters, and keepsakes with their proper owners. These small acts of restoration carried profound meaning for men who understood how precious such connections to home had become in the dehumanizing environment of industrial warfare. Captain Geoffrey Hamilton, a former schoolmaster from Essex who commanded a company of the East Lancashire Regiment, found himself in the unprecedented position of negotiating with his German counterpart, Hauptmann Friedrich Zimmermann, about the logistics of the impromptu truce. Their meeting, conducted in the shell-damaged remains of a Belgian farmhouse that sat between the lines, combined the formality of military protocol with the surreal circumstances of their situation. Both men spoke French, which provided a neutral, linguistic ground for their discussions about boundaries, timing, and the mutual desire to extend their unofficial ceasefire through the remainder of Christmas Day. Zimmermann, a philosophy professor in civilian life who had been conscripted into service as a reserve officer, brought an intellectual perspective to their conversations that Hamilton found both surprising and refreshing. Their discussion ranged far beyond military matters, touching on literature, education, and the profound irony of their situation. Here were two educated men who in peacetime might have been colleagues or friends, forced by circumstances beyond their control to participate in each other's destruction. Key. The recognition of this absurdity created a bond between them that would influence their actions for the remainder of their service on the Western Front. The afternoon brought opportunities for more extensive cultural exchange as soldiers on both sides displayed artifacts and souvenirs from their homelands. German troops shared photographs of their families, postcards depicting scenes from their native regions, and small handicrafts created during quiet moments in their trenches. British soldiers reciprocated with pictures of English countryside, Scottish highlands, and Welsh valleys, along with letters from home that painted pictures of a world far removed from the devastation surrounding them. These exchanges served as windows into lives and landscapes that existed beyond the narrow focus of military objectives. Music continued to play a central role in the day's events, with soldiers from both sides teaching each other songs from their respective traditions. The Germans introduced their British counterparts to Lorelei and other folk songs that spoke of rivers, forests, and peaceful domestic scenes. In return, British soldiers shared music hall favorites and traditional ballads that painted pictures of London streets, country lanes, and seaside towns. The act of learning each other's songs created intimate moments of cultural transmission that bridged linguistic barriers and revealed the common human experiences that united men from different nations. Private Johann Kruger, Pekka's apprentice from Berlin, discovered that he shared a trade with Lance Corporal James Thompson from Manchester. Their conversation about bread-making techniques, conducted through a mixture of German, English, and enthusiastic gesturing, revealed the universal nature of craft and the satisfaction that came from creating something nourishing for others. Kruger showed Thompson a small notebook where he had recorded recipes and techniques learned from master bakers, while Thompson described the industrial bakeries of Manchester and the changes that mechanization had brought to their shared profession. Their technical discussion provided relief from the emotional intensity of their situation, reinforcing their connection through shared expertise. The exchange of food became another significant element of the day's activities. German soldiers who had received packages from home containing traditional Christmas treats shared Lepiken, Stollen, and other seasonal delicacies with their British counterparts. British troops reciprocated with their emergency chocolate, rations, tinned goods, and the occasional luxury items that arrived in packages from England. These exchanges carried symbolic weight that far exceeded their nutritional value, representing acts of trust and generosity between men who had been trained to view each other as mortal enemies. Medical personnel from both sides found themselves cooperating in ways that their training had not anticipated. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German field surgeon, worked alongside Captain Robert Morrison, a British medical officer, to treat soldiers who had been wounded in the days preceding the truce. Their collaboration transcended national boundaries as they shared medical supplies, techniques, and knowledge gained through months of battlefield experience. The sight of enemy medical officers working together to save lives provided powerful testimony to the healing profession's fundamental commitment to human welfare regardless of political allegiances. The presence of interpreter soldiers who spoke multiple languages became crucial for facilitating deeper conversations between the two sides. These men found themselves serving as bridges between cultures, translating not just words, but concepts and emotions that had previously been impossible to communicate. Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann, a German soldier who had studied at Oxford before the war, moved freely between the groups, facilitating conversations that revealed the educational, professional, and personal backgrounds of men who had been reduced to anonymous enemies in each other's military planning. As evening approached, both sides began to grapple with the reality that their unofficial truce would soon end, the return to hostilities. While inevitable, given the larger political and military context of the war, posed emotional and practical challenges that no military manual had addressed. How could men who had shared meals, stories, and songs return to trying to kill each other? How could soldiers who had worked together to bury their dead resume the creation of new corpses? These questions weighed heavily on participants as the day's light began to fade. The documentation of the day's events became a priority for many soldiers, sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented that deserved to be preserved. For posterity, sketches were made, notes were taken, and photographs were captured wherever cameras were available. These records, created under extraordinary circumstances, would later serve as crucial evidence of the event's reality for a world that would struggle to believe such a thing had actually occurred in the midst of history's most destructive conflict. Religious services, conducted jointly by chaplains from both armies, provided another dimension to the day's activities. Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox traditions were represented among the soldiers. In the Christmas celebration offered common ground for men whose faiths shared fundamental beliefs about peace, forgiveness, and human dignity. The sight of German, and British soldiers kneeling together in prayer created images that challenged every assumption about the incompatibility of their national interests. The gradual recognition that they shared similar complaints about their respective military hierarchies created another bond between the soldiers. Stories of incompetent officers, inadequate supplies, and poor communication revealed that the institutional failures of war affected both armies equally. This shared experience of bureaucratic frustration and military inefficiency provided common ground for men who discovered that their real enemies might not be the soldiers facing them across no man's land, but the distant politicians and generals who had created their predicament. Personal stories emerged throughout the day as soldiers shared information about their backgrounds, the reasons for joining the army, and their hopes for the future. Many discovered that they had been motivated by similar factors: economic necessity, family pressure, or simple patriotic duty rather than hatred for their enemies. These revelations helped humanize a conflict that had been presented to them in terms of national survival and moral absolutes, revealing, instead, a complex web of personal circumstances and political decisions that had created their mutual tragedy. The day's events also revealed the profound loneliness that affected soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Separated from families, friends, and familiar environments, these men had been starved for genuine human connection. It's the opportunity to speak freely with other human beings, even enemies, fulfilled a basic psychological need that military discipline and unit cohesion could not completely satisfy. The conversations that took place during the truce provided emotional relief that would sustain many participants through the difficult months that lay ahead as darkness fell on Christmas Day, 1914. Soldiers on both sides began the reluctant process of returning to their respective trenches. The transition was gradual and melancholy, marked by final exchanges of addresses, promises to write after the war, and expressions of hope that they might meet again under better circumstances. The sight of men who had spent the day as friends, slowly transforming back into enemies, created a profound sense of loss that would haunt many participants for the rest of their lives. The morning of December 26 dawned gray and cold, carrying with it the weight of an inevitable return to the business of war. Imagine yourself standing in the communication trench behind the British lines, watching as soldiers who had spent Christmas Day sharing cigarettes and stories with their enemies now cleaned their rifles and prepared for the resumption of hostilities. The transformation was not immediate. The psychological bridges built during the truce could not be demolished as easily as they had been constructed, but military necessity and officer pressure gradually reasserted the disciplines of organized violence. Captain Hamilton found himself facing a crisis of command. Unlike anything his military training had prepared him to handle, his men, who had returned from no man's land with German addresses written on scraps of paper and promises to correspond after the war, now struggled to reconcile their new understanding of their enemy's humanity with their military duty to destroy them. Keamy, Private Morrison, who had spent an hour teaching a young German soldier to play cards, reported to his captain that he could no longer imagine firing his rifle with the intent to kill. The disconnect between personal experience and military necessity created psychological tensions that threatened unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. Across the lines, Hauptmann Zimmermann grappled with similar challenges as his soldiers demonstrated marked reluctance to return to aggressive action. The Bavarian regiment under his command had formed particularly strong bonds with their British counterparts, sharing not only food and songs, but personal stories that revealed the arbitrary nature of their conflict. Sergeant Weber, the carpenter, who had worked alongside Irish Corporal O'Sullivan to recover bodies from no man's land, refused direct orders to fire on British positions, claiming he could not bring himself to shoot at men whose names and families he now knew. Such individual acts of rebellion, while understandable on human grounds, posed serious threats to military discipline and the prosecution of the war. The response from higher command came swiftly and decisively. General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, ISSUED, orders prohibiting any further fraternization with the enemy, threatening court-martial for any soldier who attempted to repeat the Christmas truce. Similar orders flowed down through the German command structure, often accompanied by threats to transfer uncooperative units to more dangerous sectors of the front. The military hierarchies of both armies recognized that the spontaneous humanity displayed during the truce posed a fundamental threat to their ability to maintain the war effort, challenging the psychological foundations upon which modern military organization depended. The enforcement of renewed hostilities required careful orchestration to overcome the reluctance of soldiers who had experienced their enemy's humanity firsthand. Officers were instructed to gradually escalate the level of violence, beginning with limited artillery bombardments aimed at positions rather than personnel, slowly rebuilding the psychological barriers that made killing possible. Sniper activity, conducted by specialists who had not participated in the truce, served to remind ordinary soldiers of the danger posed by enemy positions and to recreate the atmosphere of mutual threat necessary for sustained combat operations. Private Davies, the Welsh coal miner whose powerful voice had led the British Christmas carol singing, found himself assigned to a listening post in no man's land just 3 days after the truce. His mission was to gather intelligence on German positions and movements, but he discovered that his knowledge of individual German soldiers made the task psychologically impossible. When he spotted Johann Kruger, the Berlin baker with whom he had shared stories about bread-making techniques, Davies found himself unable to report the German's position to his superiors. The personal connection formed during the truce had created loyalty. Conflicts that military discipline could not easily resolve. The letters that soldiers had promised to write to their former enemies became a source of ongoing concern for military censors on both sides. Mail containing German addresses was confiscated from British soldiers, while German postal authorities intercepted correspondence addressed to England. These letters, when they survived the censorship process, revealed the depth of connection that had been formed during the brief truce. Soldiers wrote about shared experiences, asked about each other's families, and expressed hopes for a swift end to the conflict that would allow them to meet again under peaceful circumstances. The correspondence represented a form of resistance to the dehumanization that war required, maintaining human connections across battle lines. The psychological impact of the truce extended far beyond the immediate participants, affecting soldiers throughout both armies as stories of the Christmas fraternization spread through the communication networks that linked frontline units. Men who had not directly participated in the truce found their own attitudes toward the enemy subtly altered by accounts of shared humanity discovered across no man's land. The knowledge that German soldiers sang the same hymns, carried similar photographs of loved ones, and expressed comparable hopes and fears challenged the propaganda narratives that portrayed the enemy as fundamentally different and deserving of destruction. Medical officers on both sides reported increased incidents of what would later be termed combat stress reactions among soldiers who had participated in the Christmas truce. The cognitive dissonance created by having to resume violence against men they had come to see as individuals rather than enemies produced symptoms ranging from chronic insomnia to complete inability to function in combat situations. Dr. Morrison, the British medical officer who had worked alongside his German counterpart to treat wounded soldiers, documented several cases of men who developed physical symptoms, trembling hands, inability to aim weapons accurately, panic attacks triggered by German voices that seemed directly related to their Christmas experiences. The impact on unit morale varied significantly depending on how individual commanders handled the transition back to active warfare. Officers who acknowledged the difficulty of their soldiers' situation and allowed them to process their Christmas experiences gradually achieved better long-term combat effectiveness than those who attempted to force immediate return to aggressive action. Captain Hamilton, working with his company's sergeant major, developed informal counseling sessions where soldiers could discuss their conflicted feelings about resuming hostilities against men they had come to know personally. These sessions, while unprecedented in military practice, helped his unit maintain combat readiness while processing the emotional complexity of their situation. The Christmas truce also had profound effects on military strategy and tactics in the months that followed. Both German and British commanders recognized that the spontaneous fraternization had revealed dangerous vulnerabilities in their soldiers' willingness to maintain sustained hostility toward a humanized enemy. Training programs were modified to include stronger emphasis on dehumanizing propaganda and to reduce opportunities for personal contact with enemy forces. Patrol activities were restructured to minimize the possibility of extended interaction between opposing soldiers. While new regulations strictly prohibited any form of communication across battle lines, religious services in the weeks following Christmas took on special significance as chaplains from both armies struggled to address the theological and moral questions raised by the truce. How could Christian soldiers be expected to kill men with whom they had celebrated the birth of the Prince of Peace? The disconnect between religious teaching and military necessity created spiritual crises that affected not only the soldiers who had participated in the fraternization, but also the clergy charged with maintaining their morale and spiritual welfare. Some chaplains began to question their own role in supporting a war that seemed to contradict fundamental Christian teachings about love and forgiveness. The propaganda machines of both nations worked overtime to minimize the significance of the Christmas truce and to reinforce the narrative of irreconcilable national differences that justified continued warfare. Newspaper accounts of the fraternization were heavily censored or suppressed entirely, while official statements emphasized isolated incidents rather than the widespread nature of the cessation of hostilities. Government authorities recognized that knowledge of the truce's extent might undermine popular support for the war by revealing that the soldiers themselves had demonstrated the possibility of peaceful coexistence. Individual soldiers found various ways to cope with the psychological burden of returning to violence against men they had humanized, compartmentalize their Christmas experiences, treating them as a temporary suspension of reality that had no bearing on their military duties. Others developed elaborate justifications for continued fighting, arguing that their personal connections with individual enemy soldiers did not change the larger political and strategic imperatives that drove the conflict. A few simply refused to participate in offensive operations, accepting punishment, or transfer rather, and violating the bonds of human fellowship they had discovered during the truce. The long-term effects of the Christmas truce extended well beyond the immediate resumption of hostilities, influencing the way participants viewed warfare, nationalism, and human nature for the rest of their lives. Veterans who had experienced the fraternization often became advocates for international understanding and peaceful resolution of conflicts. Their Christmas experiences serving as proof that ordinary people from different nations could find common ground when freed from the artificial constraints of political and military ideology. Their testimonies, preserved in letters, diaries, and later interviews, provide a powerful evidence of humanity's capacity for reconciliation, even in the midst of its most destructive enterprises. The memory of the Christmas truce became a form of psychological resistance to the dehumanization that military service required. Soldiers would recall their conversations with enemy troops during moments of particular brutality, or when propaganda attempted to portray the enemy as subhuman monsters. The knowledge that German soldiers missed their families, worried about their futures, shared similar hopes and dreams served as an antidote to the hatred that military authorities tried to cultivate. This internal resistance, while rarely expressed openly, represented a form of spiritual survival that helped many soldiers maintain their humanity throughout the war's devastating duration. In the immediate aftermath of the truce, both armies implemented new policies designed to prevent similar fraternization in the future. Rotation of units became more frequent to prevent soldiers from developing familiar relationships with enemy forces in adjacent positions. Artillery bombardments were scheduled more regularly to maintain an atmosphere of constant threat and to discourage any tendency toward informal communication. Most significantly, the recruitment and promotion of officers emphasized the importance of maintaining aggressive attitudes toward the enemy and the ability to enforce such attitudes among subordinate troops. The legacy of the Christmas Truce of 1914 extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, becoming a symbol of human potential that transcended the political and ideological divisions that created the war. For those who participated in it, the experience served as evidence that ordinary people, when freed from the artificial constraints of nationalism and military discipline, naturally sought connection and understanding rather than conflict and destruction. This knowledge, carried by veterans into the post-war world, influenced literature, politics, and social movements for decades to come, providing a counter-narrative to the glorification of warfare and national antagonism that had made the Great War possible. The archaeologist's trowel moves carefully through layers of soil that have remained undisturbed for over a century, each scrape revealing fragments of a world that existed in the shadow of constant death. Imagine yourself kneeling beside Dr. Marie Dubois in a field near Verdun, France, where recent construction work has uncovered what appears to be a section of German's trench system from the 1916 battle. The earth here tells stories in a language of rust and bone, of personal artifacts and military debris that paint intimate portraits of men who lived, fought, and often died in this contested ground during the war's longest and bloodiest engagement. The soil composition itself serves as a historical document, its layers marking the passage of seasons and the intensity of bombardment that transformed this landscape into something resembling the surface of an alien planet. The topsoil, dark and rich with organic matter, gives way to bands of clay mixed with metal fragments, shell casings, barbed wire, and the twisted remnants of equipment that once represented the height of military technology. Deeper still, archaeologists encounter layers of sand and gravel that were brought in by military engineers, attempting to create stable foundations for trenches and ground that have been pulverized by months of artillery fire. The first significant discovery came when Dr. Dubois's team uncovered a section of wooden duckboard, the slatted walkway that allowed soldiers to move through trenches without sinking into the omnipresent mud. The wood, preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the waterlogged trench system, still bore the marks of hobnailed boots and the gouges created by men stumbling through darkness under the weight of equipment and exhaustion. Chemical analysis of the wood revealed traces of creosote and other preservatives used by German military engineers, while microscopic examination showed fragments of fabric and leather that had been ground into the surface by countless footsteps. Beneath the duckboards lay a treasure trove of personal artifacts that had been lost or discarded during the chaos of trench warfare. A brass button from a Bavarian regiment's uniform lay next to a bent spoon that bore the initials HM, carved with the careful precision of someone with time to kill and nothing but metal implements with which to occupy their hands. These objects, separated by inches in the soil, represented different moments in the trench's history. The button, perhaps torn from a uniform during rapid movement under fire. The spoon lost during a hurried meal consumed between bombardments. The archaeological team's most poignant discovery was a leather wallet, its contents miraculously preserved by the chemical conditions of the waterlogged trench. Inside, they found photographs printed on the sturdy cardboard stock popular in early 20th century German studios. The images showed a young man in civilian clothes standing beside a woman in a white dress. Key, their faces serious but hopeful in a formal style of pre-war portraiture. A second photograph depicted the same man in military uniform. Its transformation from civilian to soldier, documented in the slight stiffening of his posture, and the addition of the spiked helmet that would become synonymous with the German military. Imagery. Dr. Dubois carefully extracted letters from the wallet. Their paper so fragile that it threatened to disintegrate at the slightest touch, written in the elaborate Gothic script that was standard for educated Germans of the period. The letters were dated between September and November 1916, spanning the critical months of the Verdun offensive. The correspondence revealed the identity of the wallet's owner as Unteroffizier Heinrich Müller, schoolteacher from a small town near Stuttgart, who had been conscripted into the 124th Infantry Regiment. His letters home spoke of homesickness, concern for his wife's health, and the growing realization that the war would last far longer than anyone had initially predicted. The archaeological context of Müller's wallet provided additional information about the circumstances of its loss. The artifact was found in a section of the trench that showed evidence of hasty abandonment, personal effects, scattered rather than carefully packed, equipment left behind that soldiers would normally have taken with them during organized withdrawal. Analysis of the surrounding soil layers suggested that this area had been subjected to intense artillery bombardment, possibly during the French counteroffensive that began in October 1916. The wallet's position, buried beneath debris from collapsed timber supports, indicated that Müller had either been killed during the bombardment or forced to flee so quickly that he could not retrieve his most precious possessions. Further excavation revealed the remains of a dugout that had been carved into the chalky soil characteristic of the Verdun region. The underground chamber, approximately 8 feet square and 6 feet deep, showed evidence of careful construction and long occupation. Wooden support beams, many of them marked with carved initials and dates, created a framework that had protected its occupants from all but direct hits by heavy artillery. The floor of the dugout was covered with a layer of straw that had been compressed over time into a dense mat, beneath which lay dozens of small artifacts that told the story of daily life in this subterranean refuge. Among the most fascinating discoveries in the dugout were improvised chess pieces carved from chalk and coal, evidence of the creative ways soldiers found to pass the endless hours between battles. The pieces showed remarkable craftsmanship, with detailed faces carved into the royal figures and careful attention paid to proportion and symmetry. Analysis of the carving techniques suggested multiple creators, indicating that the chess set had been a collaborative project that occupied several soldiers over an extended period. The presence of the game pieces, along with the makeshift board scratched into a flat piece of wood, spoke to the human need for intellectual stimulation and social interaction, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The archaeological team also uncovered evidence of the soldiers' attempts to maintain connections with their civilian lives through creative expression. Carved into the wooden walls of the dugout were elaborate decorations that combined military motifs with images from home eagles perched on branches that might have grown in German forests. Gothic letters spelling out the names of distant towns and villages in intricate patterns that echoed the decorative traditions of various German regions. These carvings required considerable time and skill to complete, suggesting periods of relative quiet when soldiers could focus on activities that affirmed their cultural identity and artistic capabilities. Personal hygiene artifacts found in the dugout revealed the ingenious methods soldiers developed to maintain some semblance of cleanliness in impossible conditions. A shaving kit, complete with razor, soap dish, and small mirror, had been carefully arranged on a wooden shelf carved into the trench wall. The mirror, although cracked, still reflected light, while the razor showed signs of careful maintenance, despite the corrosive effects of the damp environment. Chemical analysis of residue in the soap dish revealed traces of lye-based soap mixed with various organic compounds, suggesting that soldiers had learned to create their own cleaning products when military supplies proved inadequate. The team's discovery of medical supplies in the dugout provided insight into the healthcare challenges faced by frontline troops. Bandages made from torn fabric had been carefully cleaned and folded for reuse, while small bottles contained remnants of various medicines and antiseptics. Crude surgical kit consisting of knives that had been sterilized and sharpened for medical use suggested that soldiers had been forced to provide their own emergency medical care when professional help was unavailable. The presence of these improvised medical supplies spoke to both the frequency of injuries in trench warfare and the resourcefulness of men who adapted civilian skills to military necessities. Food, preparation, and consumption left extensive archaeological evidence that revealed the reality of military nutrition during the Verdun campaign. Cooking utensils made from recycled tin cans showed the scratches and dents of heavy use, while fragments of pottery suggested that soldiers had somehow acquired civilian dishes to supplement their military mess kits. Chemical analysis of residue in cooking pots revealed traces of various food substances, including horse meat, turnips, unidentified vegetation that soldiers had foraged from the devastated landscape. The archaeological evidence painted a picture of chronic hunger, alleviated by whatever sustenance could be obtained through official channels, foraging, or trading with other units. The excavation also revealed evidence of the psychological coping mechanisms that soldiers developed to maintain their sanity in conditions that seemed designed to destroy human mental health. A collection of small wooden sculptures, each no larger than a chess piece, depicted scenes from civilian life with remarkable detail and artistry. Tiny figures of women in traditional German dress, children playing in village squares, and farmers working in peaceful fields represented escape into memories and fantasies that provided psychological refuge from the horror of their immediate surroundings. The time and care invested in creating these miniature worlds spoke to their importance as tools for mental survival. Religious artifacts found throughout the dugout complex revealed the role that faith played in soldiers' attempts to find meaning in their suffering. Crude wooden crosses carved from ammunition box materials bore inscriptions in various German dialects that spoke of hope, resignation, and appeals for divine protection. A small shrine, created in a niche carved into the trench wall, contained candle stubs, religious medals, and scraps of paper bearing prayers written in multiple hands. The shrine showed evidence of regular use, with wax deposits and wear patterns that suggested it had served as a focal point for communal worship and private meditation. The archaeological evidence also documented the constant struggle against the environmental conditions that made trench warfare so physically and psychologically demanding. Drainage systems, constructed from salvaged materials and constantly maintained against the infiltration of water, showed the engineering skills that ordinary soldiers developed to make their positions habitable. Pumps made from modified equipment attempted to remove water that seeped constantly through the chalk walls, while elaborate gutter systems channeled rain and groundwater away from living areas. The sophistication of these improvised engineering solutions demonstrated the resourcefulness and technical competence of men who had learned to survive in conditions that challenged every aspect of human endurance. The team's most emotionally powerful discovery came in the form of a letter that had been written but never sent, found pressed between the pages of a prayer book in the deepest part of the dugout. The letter, addressed to Mein Liebste Anna, my dearest Anna, contained the final thoughts of a soldier who seemed to sense that he might not survive the next assault. Written in a careful hand that suggested education and deliberation, the letter spoke of love that transcended the horror of war, of hope for a future that the writer might not live to see, and of gratitude for memories that provided comfort in his darkest moments. The letter's presence in the archaeological record served as a testament to the enduring power of human connection, even in circumstances designed to destroy every trace of individual humanity. The methodical excavation of the Verdun trenches continued to yield discoveries that transformed abstract historical knowledge into tangible connections with individual human experiences. Dr. Dubois and her team worked with the reverence of those who understood they were handling the most intimate possessions of men who had lived and died in circumstances almost beyond modern comprehension. Each artifact required careful documentation, not only of its physical properties, but of its spatial relationship to other objects, creating a three-dimensional puzzle that revealed the layered complexity of trench life and the various ways soldiers had adapted to their extraordinary circumstances. The discovery of a cache of musical instruments in a collapsed section of the trench system provided unexpected insight to the role that music played in maintaining morale and human connection under conditions of extreme stress. A harmonica, its metal casing green with corrosion, but its internal mechanisms still intact, lay next to the remnants of a violin that had been carefully disassembled and wrapped in oilcloth in an unsuccessful attempt to protect it from the dampness that pervaded every aspect of trench life. The violin's neck bore carved initials and a date, KS 1916, while its body showed evidence of amateur repairs performed with whatever materials could be scavenged from the military environment. Chemical analysis of the oiled cloth revealed traces of various substances that soldiers had used in their preservation efforts: lanolin from military-issue leather conditioner, beeswax that might have come from candles, and what appeared to be human hair oil, suggesting that soldiers had sacrificed their own grooming supplies to protect their musical instruments. Care taken to preserve these items spoke to their enormous psychological value as connections to civilian life and as tools for creating beauty in an environment dedicated to destruction. The violin's amateur repairs, evident in the crude gluing and the replacement of strings with wire salvaged from military equipment, demonstrated both the desperation to maintain these connections and the ingenuity soldiers developed in adapting civilian skills to military circumstances. Near the musical instruments, the archaeological team uncovered what appeared to be the remains of a small library that soldiers had assembled from various sources. Books in German, ranging from technical manuals to poetry collections, had been carefully wrapped in waterproof materials and stored in a wooden box constructed from ammunition crate materials. The collection included Goethe's Faust, a volume of Heine's poetry, several technical engineering texts, and what appeared to be a children's picture book whose bright illustrations had somehow survived the acidic soil conditions that had destroyed so many other paper artifacts. The marginalia in these books provided fascinating insight into the intellectual lives of soldiers who had often been dismissed by military historians as simple peasants and laborers. Careful pencil notations in multiple hands showed that the books had been shared among several readers, with comments and discussions carried on across time through written exchanges in the margins. One particularly poignant note, written next to a romantic poem in the Heine collection, read, "Far Maria, when ich zurkomme, for Maria, when I return," while another hand had added below it, "Sie wartet nicht, she is not waiting," suggesting both hope and disillusionment within the trench community. Personal correspondence formed the largest category of paper artifacts recovered from the site, with letters representing every stage of the war's progression, from optimistic beginning to grim endurance. The earliest letters, dating from late 1914 and early 1915, displayed handwriting that was careful and controlled, suggesting soldiers who still had time and psychological space for considered composition. These early letters spoke of confidence in quick victory, concern for family members left behind, and detailed descriptions of military life that suggested their writers expected their experiences to be temporary and interesting rather than traumatic and transforming. Later correspondence showed marked changes in both content and physical appearance that reflected the psychological impact of prolonged exposure to combat conditions. Handwriting became more hurried and irregular, while the content shifted from detailed descriptions of military life to brief, coded messages that attempted to reassure family members without revealing the true horror of the writer's circumstances. Censorship marks, visible as black ink blocks over sensitive content, appeared with increasing frequency in later letters, while some correspondence showed evidence of self-censorship as soldiers learned to edit their own thoughts to avoid causing distress to loved ones or attracting unwanted attention from military authorities. The archaeological team's discovery of a soldier's attempt to create a photographic record of trench life provided unprecedented visual documentation of the excavated position. Camera, crude by modern standards but sophisticated for its time, had been carefully protected in a waterproof case along with several glass plate negatives that had somehow survived more than a century of burial. When developed using period-appropriate techniques, photographs revealed images of the trench system during active occupation, showing soldiers engaged in daily activities that had previously existed only in written descriptions. One particularly striking photograph showed a group of soldiers gathered around what appeared to be a makeshift Christmas celebration, with evergreen branches arranged on sandbags and candles providing illumination in the underground darkness. The men's faces, clearly visible in the photograph's sharp detail, showed the premature aging that was characteristic of frontline troops, with hollow cheeks and hollow eyes that spoke to chronic malnutrition and psychological stress. Yet their expressions in this moment showed genuine happiness, suggesting the enormous importance of these brief respites from the routine of survival and violence. Personal grooming and hygiene artifacts revealed the desperate attempts soldiers made to maintain some connection to their civilian identities, despite conditions that seemed designed to strip away every trace of individual humanity. A shaving kit, complete with several razors in various states of repair, showed evidence of constant maintenance and creative adaptation to military conditions. The razors had been resharpened so many times that their original shape was barely recognizable, while the shaving brush showed signs of having been repaired with whatever materials were available, including wire and fabric from military equipment. A collection of dental care implements, ranging from professionally manufactured toothbrushes to crude picks carved from wood and bone, documented soldiers' ongoing battle against the dental problems that plagued frontline troops. Contemporary medical records indicate that dental disease was endemic among soldiers who lacked access to proper nutrition and dental care, making these simple implements crucial tools for maintaining basic health. The evidence of repeated repair and modification of these tools suggested both their importance to their owners and the difficulty of obtaining replacements through official military supply channels. The discovery of gaming and entertainment materials provided insight into the psychological coping mechanisms that soldiers developed to maintain their sanity during the long periods of waiting that characterized trench warfare. Playing cards, worn smooth by countless hands and marked with penciled scorekeeping notations, bore witness to the thousands of hours soldiers spent in games that provided distraction from their circumstances. Dice carved from bone and wood showed the artisanal skills that some soldiers had developed, while improvised game boards scratched into wooden surfaces documented the creation of entertainment systems that required no external materials or supplies. Religious artifacts found throughout the excavation site revealed the complex role that faith played in soldiers' attempts to find meaning in their suffering and hope for survival in seemingly hopeless circumstances. Crucifixes carved from ammunition materials, rosaries made from salvaged beads and wire, and prayer books whose pages had been carefully repaired with whatever adhesive materials could be found, all spoke to the persistence of spiritual life under conditions that challenged every belief in divine providence and human dignity. The wear patterns on these religious objects indicated constant use, while their placement in the most protected areas of the dugout complex suggested their enormous psychological importance to their owners. Medical and first aid supplies discovered in the trenches documented both the frequency of injury in the combat environment and the resourcefulness of soldiers displayed in caring for themselves and their comrades when professional medical help was unavailable. Bandages made from torn clothing had been carefully cleaned and prepared for reuse, while improvised splints created from wooden ammunition crate materials showed evidence of considerable medical knowledge among ordinary soldiers who had been forced to become medics by necessity. Bottles containing various medicines and antiseptics, many of them marked with handwritten labels in multiple languages, suggested a complex trading network that allowed soldiers to obtain medical supplies from various sources. The archaeological evidence also revealed the constant struggle against vermin and disease that plagued soldiers living in conditions that would have challenged even the most robust constitution. Traps for rats, constructed from military equipment and baited with precious food scraps, showed the ongoing battle against creatures that had grown fat and bold on the abundance of human conflict. Insecticide powders, contained in improvised containers and applied with whatever implements could be fashioned for the purpose, documented soldiers' attempts to control the lice and other parasites that made their lives miserable and spread disease throughout the confined population of the trenches. Personal decoration and customization of military equipment revealed soldiers' persistent attempts to maintain individual identity within a system designed to create uniformity and anonymity. Helmets bore carved initials, painted designs, and attached talismans that reflected their owners' personalities, regional origins, and superstitions. Weapons showed similar evidence of personalization, with carved stocks, modified grips, and attached decorations that transformed standard military equipment into expressions of individual identity. These modifications, performed despite regulations that prohibited such alterations, demonstrated the importance of soldiers' case on maintaining some connection to their civilian selves. The excavation also uncovered evidence of the informal economy that developed within the trench system as soldiers found ways to obtain luxury items and personal necessities that were not provided through official military channels. Trading tokens, apparently used to facilitate exchanges of goods and services among soldiers, suggested a complex barter system that operated parallel to official military supply systems. The tokens, made from various materials and marked with symbols that indicated their value and purpose, represented an entirely separate economic system that arose from the needs and resourcefulness of soldiers who learned to create civilian-style markets within military constraints. The most profound archaeological discoveries at Verdun emerged not from individual artifacts, but from the spatial relationships between objects that told complex stories of human interaction, survival, and loss. Dr. Du Bois and her team learned to read the soil itself as a manuscript written in layers of human experience, where the position of a dropped button might indicate the location of a soldier's death, and the careful arrangement of personal effects could reveal final moments of hope or despair. The archaeological record preserved frozen moments in time that brought researchers face to face with the lived reality of men whose names had been lost to history, but whose humanity could still be touched across a span of more than a century. In one particularly poignant section of the excavation, the team discovered what appeared to be a soldier's final resting place, marked not by an official grave, but by the careful arrangement of personal possessions that suggested deliberate placement by comrades who could not provide proper burial, but refused to let their friend's memory disappear without ceremony. A helmet, pierced by shrapnel but carefully cleaned and positioned upright, served as a makeshift headstone, while personal effects, a wallet, a prayer book, and a small photograph had been arranged with the precision of a formal funeral service. The soil around these objects showed no evidence of hasty burial or random scattering. but rather the careful attention of men who understood the importance of honoring their dead, even when military necessity prohibited formal ceremonies. The photograph, protected by its placement within the wallet and the chemical conditions of the burial environment, showed a young woman holding a small child. Their face is serious but hopeful in the manner of early 20th century formal portraiture. On the back of the photograph, written in the careful script of someone who understood the importance of preserving information for posterity, were the words Greta, Undecline, Hans, Weihnachten, 1915, Greta and Little Hans, Christmas, 1915. The date suggested that this photograph had been taken during the soldier's last leave home, making it not only a cherished personal memento, but also a final visual connection to the life it left behind when he returned to the front. Nearby, the archaeological team uncovered evidence of what appeared to be a mass casualty event, possibly resulting from a direct artillery hit on a section of the trench system. The distribution of artifacts and human remains suggested that several soldiers had been killed simultaneously, their possessions scattered by the force of the explosion, but preserved by the rapid burial that followed. Among the debris, researchers found fragments of letters that had been blown apart by the blast, but whose individual pieces, when painstakingly reconstructed, revealed portions of final messages that soldiers had been writing when death arrived. Without warning, one partially reconstructed letter, written in the Gothic script characteristic of educated Germans of the period, contained fragments that read, ... Tell Mama that I thought of her apple strudel every day, ... The roses in our garden must be blooming now. These fragments, preserved by chance and recovered through archaeological detective work, provided intimate glimpses into the thoughts and memories that sustained soldiers during their final moments. The letter's incomplete state served as a metaphor for the unfinished lives and unfulfilled promises that the war had interrupted, leaving behind only fragments of stories that never be completed. The excavation also revealed evidence of the different ways soldiers chose to spend what they might have sensed were their final hours. In one dugout, archaeologists found an elaborate carved chess set that had been left in the middle of a game. The piece is positioned as if the players had simply stepped away for a moment and intended to return. The sophistication of the carving and the evidence of careful planning in the game strategy suggested that this had been more than casual entertainment. It represented an assertion of intellectual life and civilized behavior in the face of circumstances designed to reduce human beings to their most basic survival instincts. Personal grooming implements discovered throughout the site showed evidence of recent use, suggesting that soldiers had continued to maintain their appearance even when death seemed imminent. Razors showed fresh, scraping marks, while mirrors bore fingerprints that had somehow survived in the soil's protective embrace. These traces of final ablutions spoke to the persistence of human dignity and the importance soldiers placed on meeting their fate with whatever composure they could maintain. The act of shaving or combing one's hair before battle represented a form of spiritual preparation that connected these men to civilian rituals of self-care and presentation. The archaeological record also preserved evidence of final letters home that revealed the emotional complexity of soldiers who spaced the possibility of death while trying to provide comfort and reassurance to loved ones they might never see again. One letter, found in a soldier's breast pocket and protected by the oiled cloth in which he had wrapped it, contained carefully crafted lies about his safety and optimistic predictions about his return home. The contrast between the letter's cheerful tone and its discovery in a context that suggested the writer's death within hours of its composition created a powerful testimony to the protective love that motivated soldiers to shield their families from the truth of their circumstances. Religious artifacts found in association with human remains revealed the various ways soldiers prepared spiritually for the possibility of death. Crucifixes clutched in skeletal hands, rosaries wrapped around wrist bones, canned prayer books opened to specific passages all spoke to the importance of faith as a source of comfort and meaning in situations that challenged every belief in divine justice or protection. Some soldiers had apparently spent their final moments in prayer, while others had focused on reading scripture or religious poetry that provided frameworks for understanding their sacrifice in terms larger than military strategy or national politics. The discovery of unfinished creative works provided particularly moving evidence of artistic expression that had been interrupted by death. Sketches of home landscapes, portraits of fellow soldiers, and elaborate decorative patterns carved into wood all represented attempts to create beauty and preserve memory in an environment dedicated to destruction. One particularly sophisticated carving found on a wooden support beam, and apparently the work of someone with professional artistic training, depicted a peaceful village scene complete with church steeple, houses with smoking chimneys, and figures engaged in peaceful daily activities. The carving's completion stopped abruptly at the point where a shell fragment had scarred the wood, creating a visual metaphor for the interruption of creative life by violent death. Musical instruments found in contexts suggesting their owners' deaths revealed the role that music had played in soldiers' final preparations for battle or their attempts to maintain morale in the face of overwhelming odds. A harmonica, found clutched in skeletal fingers, still contained traces of saliva that had somehow been preserved by the unique chemical conditions of the burial environment. The instrument's position suggested that its owner had been playing music, perhaps for his own comfort or for the encouragement of his comrades when death arrived. Laboratory analysis of the harmonica's internal mechanisms revealed traces of several different tunes, suggesting that it had been used regularly and that music had been an important part of this soldier's daily routine. The spatial arrangement of personal effects in several locations suggested that soldiers had taken time to organize their possessions before anticipated battles, perhaps hoping that these arrangements would help identify their bodies or preserve their memory if they did not survive. Wallets had been placed in easily accessible pockets. Identification tags had been positioned for maximum visibility, and letters home had been arranged with addresses clearly displayed. These preparations spoke to soldiers' understanding of their mortality and their desire to maintain connections with home and identity, even in death. Photographic evidence discovered at the site revealed attempts to document the reality of trench life for posterity, suggesting that some soldiers understood the historical significance of their experiences and wanted to preserve visual records for future generations. Camera equipment found in protected locations had been carefully maintained despite the challenging environmental conditions, while glass plate negatives had been stored with the care typically reserved for precious documents. Photographs themselves, when successfully developed, showed scenes of remarkable intimacy and humanity. Soldiers sharing meals, writing letters, sleeping in exhausted piles. I'm engaged in the countless small activities that filled the hours between battles. Archaeological evidence also documented the persistence of hope, even in circumstances that seemed hopeless. Seeds and plant materials found in soldiers' possessions suggested attempts to grow flowers or food in the devastated landscape, while carved wooden tokens bearing dates far in the future indicated that some soldiers maintained faith in their survival and eventual return home. These artifacts of optimism, preserved in contexts that suggested their owners had not lived to see their hopes fulfilled, created powerful testimony to the human capacity for maintaining forward-looking perspectives even when surrounded by evidence of mortality and loss. Personal letters found unfinished on improvised writing surfaces revealed the difficulties soldiers faced in communicating their experiences to family members who could not possibly understand the reality of their circumstances. Draft after draft showed soldiers struggling to find words that would convey their situation without causing excessive worry, their love without sounding like farewell, and their needs without appearing to complain. The multiple attempts and careful revisions evident in these drafts spoke to the enormous importance soldiers placed on maintaining family connections and the psychological burden of serving as intermediaries between the world of war and the world of peace. The final category of artifacts that emerged from the Verdun excavation consisted of objects that had no apparent practical purpose but had been carefully preserved and protected by soldiers who obviously valued them for reasons that transcended utility. Smooth stones that had been carried from distant places, pressed flowers that had somehow been preserved between the pages of books, and small wooden sculptures that served no function beyond aesthetic pleasure, all spoke to the human need for beauty and connection that persisted even in the most utilitarian environment imaginable. These objects, preserved by soldiers who risked everything to maintain connections to life beyond survival, served as final testimony to the persistence of human nature, even under conditions designed to destroy everything that made life worth living. Far from the mud and desperation of the Frontline trenches, in a requisitioned chateau 25 miles behind the lines near Amiens, the afternoon tea service proceeded with the measured precision of peacetime ritual. Imagine yourself settling into one of the leather chairs in the library of what had been transformed into the officers' club of the British Expeditionary Force, where men who held the power of life and death over thousands of soldiers gathered each day at 4 o'clock to discuss strategy over delicate china cups and carefully arranged cucumber sandwiches. The contrast between this world and the reality experienced by the men under their command created a psychological chasm that shaped military decision-making in ways that would have profound consequences for the conduct of the war. Colonel Reginald Pemberton Smith, a career officer whose military experience had been acquired primarily in the administrative offices of Whitehall rather than on active battlefields, lifted his teacup with the precise movements of someone for whom such rituals represented the foundation of civilization itself. The porcelain, part of a spode service that had been hastily requisitioned from the chateau's original owners, bore delicate floral patterns that seemed to mock the reality of the industrial slaughter being directed from these comfortable rooms. The incongruity between the refined elegance of the tea service and the brutal efficiency of the military machine it served created a cognitive dissonance that most officers solved by maintaining strict mental separation between their comfortable daily routines and the consequences of their strategic decisions. The chateau itself had been chosen for its location and amenities rather than its defensive capabilities. Situated in the countryside that remained largely untouched by the physical devastation of the war zone, the building's original function as a summer residence for wealthy Parisians had left it equipped with all the comforts that military hierarchy considered necessary for effective command. Spacious rooms for conferences and planning sessions, a well-stocked wine cellar, formal dining facilities, and extensive grounds where officers could take constitutionals between their administrative duties. The preservation of such luxuries, even in wartime, reflected the military establishment's belief that effective leadership required the maintenance of social distinctions and civilized behavior that separated commanders from the ranks they directed. General Sir Arthur Blackwood occupied the head of the largest table in the club's main salon, his uniform impeccably maintained by an orderly who ensured that every button gleamed and every crease fell precisely where regulations demanded. Blackwood, whose last direct combat experience had occurred during the Boer War more than a decade earlier, approached the current conflict with the methodical mindset of someone trained to view warfare as an intellectual exercise in logistics and resource management. His daily routine included morning briefings conducted over perfectly prepared breakfast, afternoon strategic sessions accompanied by tea and biscuits, and evening social gatherings where officers could maintain the social connections that were considered essential for effective military cooperation. The transformation of the chateau's original spaces reflected the military's attempt to create familiar institutional environments even in foreign territory. The morning room had become a map room where colored pins and flags tracked the movement of armies across terrain that few of the planning officers had ever seen firsthand. The conservatory had been converted into a communications center where telegraph messages arrived hourly with casualty reports, supply requests, and intelligence updates that were discussed in the abstract language of military efficiency rather than the human terms that might have conveyed their true impact. The billiard room retained its original function, but now served as an informal space where officers could discuss sensitive matters away from the scrutiny of subordinates or official recorders. Major Jeffrey Worthington's responsibilities included liaison with the French military authorities, found himself navigating cultural differences that extended far beyond language barriers. The French officers with whom he collaborated daily brought different expectations about military hierarchy, strategic thinking, and the relationship between military and civilian authority that challenged British assumptions about proper command structure. Their afternoon meetings, conducted in a mixture of English and French over coffee and pastries, revealed fundamental differences in military philosophy that would influence tactical decisions and strategic planning throughout the war's duration. These cultural negotiations, while seemingly peripheral to combat operations, actually shaped the coordination of Allied key efforts in ways that directly affected battlefield outcomes. The daily routine of the Officers' Club reflected a determined effort to maintain peacetime social conventions despite the unprecedented nature of their wartime responsibilities. Morning inspections of their own appearance and quarters maintained standards of personal presentation that were considered essential for military discipline and effective leadership. Breakfast was served at precisely 8 o'clock in the formal dining room, where officers were expected to engage in conversation that demonstrated their education, cultural sophistication, and ability to maintain composure under pressure. These social rituals served multiple functions. They reinforced hierarchy and group cohesion, provided opportunities for informal information exchange, maintained psychological connections to civilian life that helped officers cope with the stress of command responsibility. The library, which retained much of its original collection of French literature and philosophy, became an unexpected resource for officers seeking intellectual stimulation and psychological escape from their military duties. Evening reading sessions, conducted in comfortable chairs before a fireplace that provided both warmth and ambience, allowed educated officers to maintain connections to the intellectual life they had enjoyed in civilian careers. The books themselves, ranging from classic literature to contemporary political theory, provided frameworks for understanding their current experience that purely military training had not anticipated. Some officers found in these reading sessions opportunities to grapple with the moral and philosophical implications of their role in directing industrial-scale warfare. The entertainment facilities of the Marseille Chateau were adapted to serve military social functions while maintaining the appearance of civilian leisure activities. The music room housed a piano that was used for evening concerts where officers could demonstrate musical abilities that reinforced their claims to cultural sophistication and social status. These musical evenings served as occasions for stress relief and social bonding that helped maintain unit cohesion among senior officers whose decisions would affect thousands of subordinates. The choice of music, typically limited to classical compositions and patriotic songs, reflected both personal preferences and conscious efforts to maintain appropriate tone and content for military social gatherings. The psychological mechanisms that allowed senior officers to maintain their comfortable routines while directing the destruction of human life on an unprecedented scale represented one of the war's most profound moral and intellectual challenges. Within the paneled walls of the chateau's conference rooms, strategic decisions were made using language and conceptual frameworks that systematically abstracted human suffering into mathematical calculations of acceptable losses and strategic advantages. This process of abstraction was not accidental, but rather a carefully maintained psychological defense that allowed educated, civilized men to participate in industrial-scale killing while preserving their sense of moral legitimacy and professional competence. Captain James Thornfield, whose peacetime career as a Cambridge mathematics professor had prepared him for the statistical analysis that modern warfare demanded, spent his mornings translating casualty reports into charts and graphs that transformed individual deaths into data points on strategic assessments. His work required him to calculate the human cost of various tactical options with the same dispassionate precision he had once applied to theoretical problems in pure mathematics. The psychological adaptation required for this work was profound. The development of mental compartments that allowed him to process information about mass death as numerical abstractions while maintaining his identity as a civilized, morally responsible human being. The morning briefings in the chateau's conference room followed ritualized formats that reinforced the psychological distance between decision makers and the consequences of their choices. Maps covered with colored pens and tactical symbols presented the battlefield as an abstract gaming board where units were moved according to strategic logic rather than human considerations. Reports of acceptable losses and strategic withdrawals used language that obscured the reality of wounded, dying, and psychologically shattered men. This linguistic transformation was not merely a matter of military convenience, but a psychological necessity that allowed officers to maintain their decision-making capacity without being paralyzed by the emotional weight of their responsibilities. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Cavendish, whose family connections had secured his appointment to the staff despite limited field experience, found himself responsible for approving requests for artillery bombardments that would determine the fate of thousands of men whose names he would never know and whose faces he would never see. His daily routine included reviewing targeting recommendations over morning tea, discussing ammunition allocations during lunch, and authorizing attack orders during afternoon planning sessions. The temporal and spatial distance between these administrative decisions and their battlefield consequences allowed him to maintain focus on the technical and strategic aspects of his responsibilities while avoiding direct confrontation with their human cost. The social dynamics within the Officers Club reinforced the psychological mechanisms that made such emotional detachment possible. Conversations about battlefield conditions were conducted in the abstract language of military professionalism, focusing on tactical effectiveness and strategic outcomes rather than the human suffering that such decisions created. Officers who showed excessive concern for casualty rates or who questioned the human cost of strategic decisions were subtly discouraged from expressing such views, as emotional engagement with the consequences of command decisions was seen as potentially compromising too effective leadership and military discipline. The information flow that reached senior officers was carefully filtered through multiple layers of bureaucracy that systematically removed the human elements that might have challenged the psychological defenses necessary for continued command effectiveness. Casualty reports arrived as numerical summaries rather than individual stories, while intelligence updates focused on enemy capabilities and movements rather than the human experiences of opposing forces. Medical reports emphasized aggregate health statistics and epidemic patterns rather than individual cases of suffering and trauma. This filtering process was not necessarily conscious or deliberate, but rather reflected institutional arrangements that had evolved to protect decision-makers from information that might compromise their ability to make difficult choices. Chateau's guest quarters accommodated visiting dignitaries and higher-ranking officers. Its presence reinforced the connection between military operations and the broader political and social objectives that justified the war's enormous costs. These visitors, who included members of parliament, senior civil servants, and representatives of allied governments, brought perspectives and priorities that reminded local commanders of the larger context within which their tactical decisions operated. The social interactions between military officers and civilian authorities during these visits served to reinforce the political legitimacy of military actions while providing psychological support for officers who might otherwise have questioned the morality of their roles. The maintenance of peacetime social conventions within the wartime environment of the Officers Club served multiple psychological functions that enabled continued effective command despite the unprecedented moral challenges of industrial warfare. Evening social gatherings, complete with formal dress requirements and traditional entertainment, provided officers with opportunities to demonstrate their continued connection to civilized society and their preservation of the cultural values that supposedly justified their military actions. These social rituals served as daily reminders that the officers saw themselves as guardians of civilization rather than participants in its destruction. The club's library facilities provided intellectual resources that helped officers develop conceptual frameworks for understanding their role in the war that preserved their sense of moral legitimacy and professional competence. Military history texts offered examples of previous conflicts where similar moral challenges had been successfully navigated by honorable men, while philosophical and religious works provided intellectual justifications for the application of violence in service of higher moral purposes. The reading habits of senior officers reflected their need to maintain intellectual connections to peacetime concerns while developing new conceptual tools for understanding their wartime responsibilities. Personal correspondence between officers and their families revealed the complex psychological work required to maintain relationships with loved ones who could not understand the realities of command responsibility in modern warfare. Letters home focused on administrative challenges and social activities, rather than the life and death decisions that occupied most of their working hours. This selective communication was necessary not only to protect family members from distressing information, but also to preserve officers' own psychological connections to the civilian world that provided meaning and context for their military service. The gradual realization among senior officers that their comfortable distance from battlefield realities had contributed to strategic miscalculations and unnecessary human suffering created psychological crises that would haunt military leadership for generations after the war's conclusion. As reports filtered up through the command structure about the true conditions in frontline trenches, the breakdown of morale among enlisted men, and the growing disconnect between strategic objectives and tactical possibilities, some officers began to question the institutional arrangements that had insulated them from the human consequences of their decisions. This questioning process was painful and often incomplete, as it required officers to confront the possibility that their professional competence and moral legitimacy had been compromised by the very systems that had been designed to support effective command. Major General Sir Edmund Worthington Clark, whose career had been built on successful staff work and administrative efficiency, found himself facing reports that challenged every assumption about the relationship between command decisions and battlefield outcomes. Intelligence summaries that at once provided reassuring evidence of strategic progress now revealed the systematic breakdown of units. Casualties had been deemed acceptable by staff calculations. Medical reports documented psychological casualties that existing military medical doctrine could not adequately explain or treat. Letters intercepted from enemy sources revealed that German officers faced similar challenges in maintaining command effectiveness despite growing awareness of their strategic situation's hopelessness. The psychological transformation required for officers to acknowledge their role in creating unnecessary suffering was complicated by institutional pressures that discouraged admission of error or expressions of doubt about command decisions. Military hierarchy depended on the appearance of confidence and competence among senior officers, while post-war political considerations required the maintenance of narratives that justified the enormous human and material costs of the conflict. Officers who expressed doubts about their decision-making processes or who advocated for significant changes in command practices found themselves marginalized within the institutional structure that had previously supported their careers and professional identities. Individual officers developed various strategies for coping with the growing awareness of the gap between their comfortable headquarters assistance and the reality experienced by the men under their command. Some attempted to bridge this gap through personal visits to frontline positions, though such visits were often carefully orchestrated to minimize exposure to conditions that might compromise command effectiveness. Others sought to reform decision-making processes to include more direct input from field commanders, though institutional resistance to such changes was often insurmountable. A few officers requested transfers to positions that would provide more direct contact with battlefield conditions, accepting reductions in rank and responsibility in exchange for psychological relief from the burden of remote command. The social dynamics within the officers' club began to reflect tensions between those who maintained faith in existing command structures and those who had begun to question the moral and practical foundations of their professional roles. Conversations that had once focused on technical and strategic matters increasingly included discussions of the war's human cost and the responsibility of command personnel for unnecessarily prolonged suffering. These discussions were often conducted carefully, as open criticism of command decisions or institutional arrangements could compromise careers and professional relationships. But the underlying tensions created subtle changes in the social atmosphere of the club. The arrival of field officers on rotation from frontline positions brought first-hand accounts of trench conditions that challenged the abstract understanding of battlefield realities that had previously informed command decisions. These officers, often bearing visible signs of the stress and trauma associated with direct combat experience, provided information that could not be filtered through the bureaucratic processes that had previously protected senior commanders from emotional engagement with the consequences of their orders. The integration of such direct testimony into command decision-making processes required psychological adjustments that some officers found impossible to make while maintaining their existing professional identities. Medical officers attached to headquarters units began documenting psychological stress symptoms among senior commanders that reflected the growing burden of moral responsibility for unprecedented levels of human destruction. Sleep disorders, anxiety symptoms, and depression became increasingly common among officers whose roles required them to maintain an appearance of confidence and competence while grappling privately with doubts about their professional effectiveness and moral legitimacy. The stigma associated with psychological symptoms in military culture made treatment difficult, while the need to maintain command effectiveness limited the therapeutic options available to affected officers. The post-war adjustment period required officers to develop new frameworks for understanding their wartime experiences and their roles in events that have transformed European civilization. Veterans organizations provided forums for discussing shared experiences, while maintaining solidarity among men who had faced similar moral and professional challenges. Memoir writing became a common method for working through the psychological complexity of command responsibility, though published accounts often emphasized strategic and technical aspects of military service rather than the moral and emotional dimensions of decision-making under extreme conditions. The relationship between former officers and the families of men who had died under their command created ongoing sources of psychological stress that required careful navigation of social expectations and personal guilt. Memorial services and veterans gatherings provided opportunities for public expressions of respect and gratitude, while avoiding direct confrontation with questions about command responsibility for unnecessary casualties. Private correspondence with bereaved families required delicate balance between acknowledging loss and maintaining institutional narratives about the necessity and honor of military sacrifice. The historical evaluation of command decisions. Institutional arrangements during the war created additional sources of stress for surviving officers as military historians and political commentators began analyzing the relationship between headquarters comfort and battlefield suffering. Public criticism of command practices required psychological defenses that some veterans found difficult to maintain, while institutional loyalty and professional solidarity created pressure to support official narratives even when private doubts persisted about command effectiveness and moral legitimacy. The educational and professional opportunities available to former officers in the post-war period often required adaptation of skills and perspectives that had been developed for military command to civilian institutional environments. The management techniques, decision-making processes, social skills that had been effective in military hierarchy did not always transfer successfully to civilian professional contexts. While the psychological frameworks that had enabled military command sometimes created difficulties in civilian relationships and social situations, the physical environments that former officers created in their post-war civilian lives often reflected attempts to recreate the comfort and social support that had been available at headquarters facilities while avoiding reminders of the military contexts that had created moral and psychological burdens. Country houses, social clubs, and professional associations provided settings for maintaining relationships with fellow veterans, while creating distance from military symbols and institutional arrangements that might trigger uncomfortable memories or emotional responses. The legacy of the Officers Club experience influenced the development of military institutional culture for decades after the war's conclusion. As military educational institutions and command training programs grappled with the lessons learned about the relationship between command, comfort, and battlefield effectiveness, reforms in military education emphasized the importance of maintaining contact with field conditions and understanding the human impact of command decisions, while institutional arrangements were modified to reduce the psychological distance between decision-makers and the consequences of their choices. The broader social and political implications of the gap between headquarters, comfort, and battlefield suffering continued to influence civilian attitudes toward military authority and the legitimacy of warfare as an instrument of national policy. Public awareness of the contrast between officers' comfortable conditions and enlisted men's suffering contributed to social changes that challenged traditional class hierarchies and questioned the competence of established leadership institutions. These social transformations reflected broader cultural shifts that emerged from the war's demonstration of the potential consequences when institutional arrangements insulated decision-makers from the human impact of their choices. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, carry with you the voices and experiences of those who lived through one of history's most transformative conflicts. From the mud-soaked dugouts where young men waited through endless hours of fear and boredom, to the momentary peace of Christmas 1914 when enemies discovered their shared humanity, to the archaeological revelations that continued to emerge from long-buried trenches, to the comfortable distance of chateau headquarters where decisions of life and death were made over afternoon tea. Each story speaks to the complexity and resilience of human nature under extraordinary circumstances. The soldiers, whose artifacts rest beneath French soil today, once wrote letters home, describing experiences for which no vocabulary existed. They carved chess pieces from chalk, shared Christmas carols across no man's land, and maintained hope for futures they might never see. Their officers, removed from the immediate danger, but burdened with impossible decisions, struggled to reconcile their comfortable daily routines with the weight of responsibility for thousands of lives. Each group, in their own way, represented the human attempt to preserve dignity, connection, and meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy such things. These stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, individuals found ways to maintain compassion, creativity, and hope. The Christmas truce revealed that beneath uniforms and national allegiances lay young men with similar dreams and fears. The archaeological record preserves evidence of artistic expression, religious faith, and loving relationships that survived in the most hostile environment imaginable. Even the psychological distance of command headquarters speaks to the human need for frameworks that make impossible decisions bearable. However imperfect those frameworks might be, tonight, as you drift toward sleep and comfort and safety that those men could only imagine, remember their struggles not as distant historical curiosities, but as testament to the enduring human capacity for survival, adaptation, and connection. Their world of mud, gas, and waiting has given way to your world of warmth, peace, and rest. In this transition from their time to yours, from conflict to peace, from struggle to comfort, find the gentle path toward dreams unmarked by the sounds of artillery, untroubled by the weight of decision, and filled instead with the quiet satisfaction of understanding how precious such simple gifts truly are.